Okay, why don't we start just now to continue to our discussion, right? Now we are in the session number 2. Our first speaker is Paolo Vignola. Let me first briefly talk about how I came to know him. Like, actually, I'm a Latin Americanist, so I had chance to talk with my colleagues in Chile, and then I talk about this event, like the Legend Qatari conference in Asia, and then he told me that you should talk to Paolo Vignola. He is the kind of one of the famous like the scholars in the Legend Qatari in Latin America. So I didn't know him, so I just find his contact number, and then I just email him inviting to this conference, and then surprisingly he said yes. So I feel very happy and grateful to him. Professor Paolo Vignola, he is a faculty member of School of Literature in Universidad de las Artes del Ecuador, located in Guayaquil, Ecuador. Also, he is a member of Latin American Druze and Qatari Studies Network. He had a PhD in philosophy from University of Genova, Italy, and he has published and edited numerous books and articles. And the title of his talk today is Geophilosophical Rizhomes in the Pandemic on Humour, Virus, and Latin American Microbiopolitics. Please welcome Professor Vignola.
Good morning to everybody, and good morning from Ecuador. Now here is night, it's 9:30 in the night. And so, well, I'm really delighted and honored to be here. I mean, here. I could use the concept of milieu used by Daniel Smith in his fantastic talk, and say that I am very happy to be here in this digital milieu with you, and I'm really happy. And I would like to warmly thanks Yung Won Park and Alex Taek Wong Lee and John Kim. Sorry for pronouncing very bad your name, but really I'm really fascinated by this kind of organization. It's fantastic. So I have 40 minutes or something less. So I go directly to my paper. And so in my talk, I would like to show a possible way to use and stress the concept of rhizome, humor, and micropolitics in order to develop a critical approach both to the biopolitical administration of the virus and to the philosophical postures that seem not to recognize that COVID-19 is a totally new challenge for the critical thought. As it is described in the call of our conference, we are witnessing a totally new event that requires at least a reconfiguration of our theoretical tools. In this vein, I welcome the idea of learning from the virus, as Paul B. Preciado and Emanuele Coccia argued. Learning from the virus as a theoretical source that should encourage us to invent new concepts worthy of what happened, and thus to mutate with the virus. Such a way to deal with the virus by mutating with it, or by becoming with, for a humanity as humus, as Haraway and Rosi Baidotti would say, could be thought as the humorist aptitude that a rhizomatic thought should express as the art of surfaces and of events. The use I suggest is precisely that of humor, that is, one that has the ability to mutate, to slide on the surface of the event, to become with it. A kind of humor that treats the very concepts as humus, that is to say, as materials to be composted in order to reframe them for such a challenge to which the pandemic and its social consequences call us. In this sense, a bright difference between humor and irony in Deleuzian terms could be found within the theoretical political debate during the first 3 months of the planetary crisis, in which we assisted to a widespread analytical theoretical production made by many contemporary thinkers, all caught up in the effort to immediately say something philosophically and politically in face of the virus. In this case, as Nelly Richard pointed out in Del descontrol de la revuelta al control de la pandemia, I translate, from the lack of control of the protest to the control of the pandemic, as Nelly Richard pointed out, the tendency of such philosophers, such as Agamben, Robert Esposito, Slavoj Žižek, among others, seemed to be that of applying powerful concepts generated in previous and very different contexts and scenarios to a situation where the biological, social, and psychological framework had been completely upset. Such way of looking at the pandemic could be conceived as ironic, to the extent that it becomes a matter of revealing that behind all these apparently new phenomena, there is always the same uncorruptible and almost eternal concept, state of exception, biopolitics, dialectic contradiction, etc., which at the end works as a Platonic idea that subsumes the multiplicity and becoming. With this concept, with this molar concept, there is always a one, a kind of transcendental unity, while for becoming with the virus, one should subtract the one from multiplicity. This is also the meaning of Haraway's slogan, staying with the trouble. I guess that the psycho-geo-biopolitical folk challenge launched by COVID-19 will likely be destined to fail if we do not understand Meredith Stratton and Donna Haraway's refrain about the importance of, I quote, ideas that we use to think other ideas, or which folks think folks, end quotes. Returning to the previous arguments, we therefore have the impression that critical thought often uses ideas, knowledge, narratives, and mental schemas that are fundamentally molar, macro-political, fixed, opposite, in order to respond to problems which precisely require a micro-political and molecular attention and care. On the other hand, on the humoristic side, as 1,000 Platos suggest, we make rhizome with our viruses, or rather, our viruses make us rhizome with other animals. And so we can say, we should make rhizomes with our viruses, or rather, our viruses should make us rhizomes with other animals. A statement that has been brightly used by both Preciado and Coccia. What we can learn from the virus is precisely the idea of mutation, and an humorist geophilosophy could stress such a mutation with the act of thinking as a continuing variation of concepts. All this, which is of great impact, especially in Paul B. Preciado, as we will see, can appear rhetorical in my talk, and indeed it is as such, at least if we do not identify on which surfaces the mutations occur, or where there are blocks that require a mutation, as much ethical and political as conceptual. Concrete micropolitics is then the ground on which these mutations can be registered, as well as they can be created. The Bolivian performer artist Maria Galindo seems therefore to evoke micropolitics when she argues that one of the effects of the pandemic has been that of erasing, minimizing, hiding, or putting aside other social and political problems that we were conceptualizing. Another micropolitical aspect is what Franco Berardi Bifo calls psychodeflation, which at the moment seems to prevent any form of active resistance, political invention, and therefore re-existence. Compared to what mapped by Deleuze and Guattari in the 80s, micropolitics today has literally become digitalized, automated, divided, and grammatized in the sense conceived by Bernard Stiegler. The platformization of the pandemic has given rise to the platformization of biopolitics, and control societies turned out to be a mix of disciplinary surveillance and hyper-control, in the sense of a renewed intervention of power in shaping orientations, behaviors, and desires. This is not only by modulating them, but also using what has been called algorithmic governmentality to articulate data extractivism and captology of the processes of subjectivation. The hypothesis is that the platformization of the pandemic is contributing to the realization of a new form of discipline, the stake of which is not only that of production, but of algorithmic immunization. The most obvious effect of this algorithmic immunization is to be found in social ecology, and even more directly in mental ecology, in regard to which more and more stimuli and instruments of exploitation are provided today. By redirecting a lot of activities to the online modality, in the case of consumption, smart shopping and smart entertainment, as in the case of production, smart working, we find ourselves constantly connected to screen, devices, and platforms that monitor us at the same time. This is what Naomi Klein described as the Screen New Deal. We could also use, as I did before, the term of hyper-control coined by Stiegler and resemantize it. I mean, to give another meaning. This control is hyper, as Stiegler said, because it depends on algorithmization, automation, and geolocalization. But, and this will be my hypothesis, it's also hyper because it adds one more dimension to the Deleuzian concept of control. And this dimension is the totalitarianism of immunization, a totalitarianism potentially embodied by each of us, precisely through a new form of discipline. Just as for Foucault, there was something of the embodiment of entrepreneurship by individuals. In this vein, I argue that the goal of digital discipline is no longer to create docile bodies. The bodies can no longer be as such, can no longer be docile, because they have all become potential uncontrolled vectors of contagion of the virus. So it is more a question of designing docile minds, not critical, not capable of support, but gregarious, fearful, calculable, predictable. This form of mind is therefore the one that hyper-controlled societies aim to discipline through the mix of new screens and new fears. Another section is micro-biopolitics. In the paper Biopolitics of Social Distancing, J.J. Silvia teaches us something interesting for a biopolitical reflection, insofar as he tells us that in the pandemic context and at the socio-sanitary level, biopolitical control produces etopoietic processes, that is, processes that create or induct behaviors, habits, and ethical conducts. More particularly, Silvia highlights the emergence of biopolitical approaches adopted and supported not only by the state, but also and proactively embodied by its citizens. In other words, in a society that applies biopolitical processes of population management, we are created as ethical subjects, and we incorporate biopolitics into our processes of subjectivation. So the capacity and responsibility to make decisions about life and death is thus not only managed by the governments, but also extended to citizens themselves through their own individual and daily choices. It's in this context in which biopolitics becomes a bioetopoiesis that we can understand the Argentinian scholar Luis Sebastian Rossi's assertions about a kind of micropolitical mutation in act, as expressed in his paper pandemic and platforms, capitalism, controllers, and coronavirus. According to Rossi, the epidemiological policies proposed in order to limit the spread of the new coronavirus are not only regulating behaviors, but through the platformization of the pandemic emergency, are also producing and conveying new statements that have to do with getting sick, moving, working, traveling, mobilizing, loving, understanding, imagining, educating, and so on. These statements have become part of our daily lives, shaping new social rhythms and orientating the way in which we think. Talking about micropolitics, it's worthy to take a few minutes to recall what Deleuze and Guattari said about it, and to explain why this analytical critical concept is once again of extreme interest in the pandemic context. In Deleuze and Guattari's micropolitical perspective, the social space is crossed by three types of superposed lines that accompany our life. Just as politics operates by macro decision and binary choices, the first species of these lines, defined as molar or rigid segmentation, cuts and classifies each individual or group according to a binary scheme through which everything is clearly split: men and women, employed and unemployed, young and old, work and vacation, and so on. Deleuze and Guattari define as binary machines the apparatuses of power that generate and cut these segments, codifying the existence of individuals through these dichotomies based on social classes, sexes, skin color, generation, productive sectors, cultural environments, and so on and so on. This was already recognized by Foucault as the task of disciplinary and surveillance societies, to establish macro-political norms, to normalize, to segment spaces, identities, times, institutions, and so on. Then Deleuze and Guattari identify two other lines: a molecular line, the one in which we are always immersed, that of the relationship with others, of desire, of becomings, which always make us betray the molar and the rigid segment. What is at stake in this line is the level of experience, and this is the properly micro-political plan. Finally, it exists a third type of lines, the lines of flight, by which an individual decides to have done with the segmentation of existence. Now, micropolitical analysis is very often confused with the promotion and evaluation of this last type of line, especially because of its revolutionary charge or the percentage of danger that it entails. However, what interests us now has more to do with the relationship between molecular lines and segment. So the first and the second line. Now, returning to pandemic hypercontrol, we can say that it operates precisely at the molecular level between the second line, the micropolitical one, and the first, the molar line, since the statements and behaviors that are produced as data are able to algorithmically crystallize themselves into identitarian segments that represent the entire social field at the macro-political level of institutions, parties, and social representations. If the cybernetic control prefigured by Deleuze should have limited itself to controlling the micro-political dimension by modulating it, the pandemic hypercontrol comes to model the micro-political dimension integrally, to model and not only to modulate. Control, therefore, is molecularized in a plastic micromanagement, which forms disciplinary patterns and identitarian segments that are added to those of the great binary divisions: class, sex, ethnicity, and so on, promoting insecurity, precariousness, panic contagion, or, on the other hand, conspirational paranoia, negationism, and archaicities of all kinds. The hypercontrol that occurs with the platformization of life in the pandemics represent, therefore, the optimal form of a micro-political management, which is valid not only for the health emergency, but also for all its secondary effect in the social sphere. I quote from Deleuze and Guattari, a macro politics of security for and through a micro politics of insecurity, or, end quotes, or in other words, the organization of a molar security based on the constant production and administration of small molecular insecurities. It is in the background of these small programmed insecurities that are now pre-calculated and anticipated that, according to Paul B. Persiado, we are witnessing to the precipitate of the biopolitics of population on the individual bodies. When Persiado affirms, and I quote, the new necropolitical frontier has passed from the coast of Greece to the door of your house. The new frontier is your epidermis. The new Lampedusa is your skin. Persiado shows the pandemic device installed at the micro-political level, by which the bodies increasingly become a breeding ground for the macro-politics of the border already applied to migrants and refugees in Europe, for instance. This is due to the fact that the measures of distancing, isolation, as well as those of checking the symptoms and reporting them adopted in response to the pandemic exacerbate a discriminatory logic towards the other, as stranger, as different, as anomalous, as unknown. That, articulated with the algorithmization of social relationship, push us to internalize, that is, to assume the danger of an invasion, in this case represented by a possible contagion. It is the same logic of identitarian segmentation that, on another scale, produced a systematic polarization of the order of discourse, based on an atavistic dualistic logic, which tends to constitute rigid opposition frames within which to include the public statements about the virus and its health, social, economic, and political management. We could thus affirm that in the pandemic, hyper-control minds are docile insofar as they remain trapped in such captological frameworks, allowing themselves to be modeled. This is why we could argue that the goal of digital discipline is no longer to fabricate docile bodies for production, as in the case of disciplinary societies. The algorithmic work of the different captologies, both public and sanitary, as well as private and commercial, seems to aim at modeling docile minds, that is not critical or supportive, but a social, fearful, calculable, predictable, as I already said. To conclude on this point, within the social-political dimension of the pandemic, a new molar and identitarian segment with the resulting dichotomous couple has been created or calcified. It does not matter whether it is articulated in denialist or securitarian or by using other more nuanced signifiers. What we should perhaps be thinking about is the political danger of this new molar and identitarian segment produced by the binary machine of the platformization of the pandemic. And once we deeply understand such a danger, we will start to be able to create concepts worthy of what happens. And we should do it, as Sueli Rolnik warns, in order to avoid the reactive micropolitics lead us to the diminution of the power of the living being's condition. So the last session, I don't know how many minutes I have, perhaps something like 10
minutes. Yes, 10 minutes.
10 minutes, perfect, okay. Last session is called The Humour of a Molecular Revolution. So it's a new part, and now I try to explain. While I was writing the paper and I was attempting to elaborate a Latin American way to conceive micropolitics in the pandemic, another event took place in Colombia, with the big and dramatic strike against the tributary reform and against government. On May 3rd, amid the protests and mobilization that occurred in the country, former President Alvaro Uribe tweeted 4 recommendations to confront the protest. The third recommendation, with an odd phrasing, referring to, and I translate, resist dissipated molecular revolution. This recommendation caused a stir, as it is also evokes the theory spread by the Chilean neo-Nazi Alexis Lopez, who views social protest as one of the many phases of a war that rages crime against institutions to seize power and end democracy. Both in Chile and Colombia, the army and police use this theory of the dissipated molecular revolution to understand social mobilization in the 21st century. And they do it because they have been personally trained by Alexis Lopez. In a conference held by the Nueva Granada Military University, named The Dissipated Molecular Revolution and How to Confront It, Lopez affirmed that the term dissipated molecular revolution refers exactly to, and I quote Lopez, carrying out a new model of horizontal revolutionary action, which it gradually normalizes disposition and behaviors on a daily basis in order to alter the state of social normality of the dominant system with the aim of being repealed and replaced. Well, of course, what Lopez makes is a misrepresentation of Guattari's perspective of a molecular revolution, Guattari's molecular revolution, to conclude that recent mobilization around the world are part of a radical leftist plan to end democracy. The immediate goal would be to generate chaos and the cessation of daily normality, to create a permanent state of tension and crisis. Lopez alleges that behind the protest, there is an intention to destabilize the regime through simultaneous and dispersed demonstration without an apparent head. In this sense, for Lopez, it would be molecular. It is a leaderless revolution that operates horizontally and is therefore more difficult to control in its attempt to overthrow democracy and its institution. To end, we can say this. From the point of view of the protest, it is possible to find a kind of militant humor precisely in the Deleuzian sense, or at least it is what appears from several texts published online in the last days about such a declaration on dissipated molecular revolution. I try to explain. The structure of the strike, whose primary goal was the resignation of the Minister of Finance, Alberto Carrasquilla, and the withdrawal of the tax reform, goal that were achieved, had the shape of a jellyfish, a viscous and blurred head, the opposition to the reform, that served as a common point for several political lines as tentacles and capillaries. But after the reform was withdrawn, the head disappeared. And what began to develop was a set of tentacles floating, dispersed, and without a common organizing center. The state's acceptation was that the protesters and activists, no longer with a reference or shared common cause, would withdraw. But that was not what happened. The multiple actors that were initially recognized in the no to reform now recognized themselves in so many exclusion and minority struggles, weaving random alliances and molecular complicities. The massive protest against the tax reform became a multiplicity in protest, or the strike of multiplicity. The strike of multiplicity, when multiplicity is the subject, whose praxis redefines the framework of the political through micro-political and transversal relationships. Diego Castaño Zapata shows how the Colombian strike and its strategic goal of blocking work, circulation, commerce, and education can be understood as the attempt to suspend and question the state binary machine and its economic, social, and hierarchical segmentation. The aim of the protest would thus be that of breaking with the segmentation of existences by moving on a plane that is not that of hard segments, but of flexibility and molecularity. As we said, the state operates through hard and binary distinctions, while A micropolitical multiplicity is a space for the creation of affects that do not correspond to the binary logics of macropolitics. The strike of multiplicity is a crowd questioning the political, seeking to disarm the binary language of the state apparatus, that is politics. The strike is building new affects, generating new molecular and transversal relationships. In this sense, there is something true in the statement of former President Uribe. Now, instead of thinking it's a wrong description of reality, instead of thinking that dissipated molecular evolution is a wrong description of reality, this molecular evolution can be thought of as a prophecy that heterogenetically confirms itself. That is, in another sense, with respect to the language of power. We could really affirm that what is in the making is a real molecular revolution, not stratified, but deployed in a plane of affective and intensity. To think like this, to find the heterogenetic self-confirmation of the dissipated molecular evolution, Deleuze would tell us, just requires a little bit of humor. I read from dialogues. An ironist is someone who discusses principles. He's seeking a first principle, a principle which comes even before the one that was thought to be first. He finds a course which is even more primary than the others. Humor is completely the opposite. Principles count for little. Everything is taken literally. The consequences are expected of you. Humor is the art of consequences or effects. Okay, fine, you give me this, you will see what happens. End quote. Humor, and I end, humor takes everything literally, is the art of consequences and effects. What then is the consequence of being conceived as a dissipated molecular revolution for the protest, for those who decided to fight without a head, without macro political representations? Perhaps it is Nietzscheanly to become what they are, multiplicities in motion, minoritarian peoples to come, inspired by an authentic molecular and transversal struggle, capable of changing how our desires are configured, how our affections are configured, how our bodies feel what they feel. As Diego Castaño said, and I end with a quote, hopefully what's happening is a molecular revolution because it will lead to cultural transformations in new flows of beliefs and desires, more supportive and free. And that is what the old power fears the most. End quote. Thank you very much for the attention.